Welcome.
A notable welcome to all you music lovers.
To
Journey
to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back
your host,
And
our dad,
Brian.
Fraser.
A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins.
Well, welcome to one and all to Journey to the Stage. This is Brian Fraser, and I hope you are doing well in your corner of the planet. And a big thank you to each of you for tuning in today. And today we have a very, very special guest that I'm really excited to get into our conversation with. Before we get started, if you do enjoy conversations like this, share this with your friends. Your kindness is what helps this podcast to grow. So telling your friends, giving ratings or reviews, those types of things go a long, long way to helping others find us. So today we are very, very honored to have Malcolm Guite with us. Malcolm is a singer-songwriter. He is a poet. He is a priest. He is a man of words, of letters. He is a professor. He has done so much. He's got quite an extensive background that we're going to have some fun looking into and investigating together today. So it is my pleasure to welcome Malcolm Guite to Journey to the Stage. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners, wherever they may be.
I think we have an audience that last count is on in over 130 countries. So it's a growing audience, and I'm really, really grateful
it's
for
that. It's an astonishing thing, really, that we can do this, that we can speak across the world like this. It's something to be grateful for.
And here I am in Central California, and you're halfway around the world there, but we have a conversation that could reach really just about anywhere on the planet, except China. I've noticed I have no listeners in China.
I'm in a little medieval town in North Norfolk called North Walsham, which has been here since Anglo-Saxon times and had its little market since 1217 and its church since the 13th century. So not much changes around here.
I love that. And it's so interesting. I've not been to England yet, but ever since I was a very small child, I have wanted to go to England. One of these days, Lord willing, I will get there. My wife studied a semester there in Sheffield, but I'm hoping to go back as a history major. Being around such old places, old things, is something that is very, very stimulating to me. So hopefully one of these days I will get back there.
Well, I hope to make it over sometime.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, and again, I'm so grateful that you're with me. And maybe let's start in the beginning a little bit. So maybe tell us where you come from, because that in and of itself is quite an interesting story. You're English, but you weren't born in England.
Yes. This is always where I come from is quite. It's quite. I mean, people think of me as very. I mean, and I think of myself as essentially English, but even quintessentially English. But no, I come from many places. I was born in Nigeria, in Ibadan, in '57. My father was a professor, an academic teaching Greek and Latin, but also a Methodist local preacher. So I'm called Malcolm now that I'm in England and Europe, as it were. But when I was a small boy in Africa, I was called Ayo, because my first name is Ayodeji, which is a Yoruba name that means joy again, or the second joy. It's a traditional name for a second child. In fact, I had my first sort of 10 years in Africa there and in Zimbabwe. But my father was an academic, so he had the long leave each thing. We used to come back to England every year. Actually, by sea. My father flew, but my mother and sister and I came by sea. So I have lots of memories of being on ships at sea as a child as well.
Wow.
Then eventually my dad, in fact, then got a post in Canada at Hamilton at McMaster University. But back in sort of 71, he came to the conclusion that I was losing my British identity, which is very funny because I'd been almost everywhere except Britain. So he sent me to a boarding school in England. When I was about 13 or so. And that was, a bit traumatic at first, but I came to love English literature, and I won a scholarship to Cambridge and went up to study English literature in 77. And because I sort of did well there and loved the place, and I did various other things, but I have been in or around Cambridge, in the county of Cambridgeshire, more or less ever since, either in role as a priest or then coming back as an academic and even as a high school teacher first, but it's always around there. So Cambridge has been, as it were, my orbit has always been close to Cambridge until I retired. We moved out of Cambridge in 2021 and now live in Norfolk. But I retired, it was an early retirement, I could still be there, but as well as being an academic and a pastor, I felt the vocation to poetry, to writing and reciting poetry, to trying to get a substantial body of poetry out there was very important. So I decided to kind of quit the day job, as it were, although I remain, of course, a priest, and I'm often helping with churches on Sundays, but in order to have time both for writing and for speaking, because I found the number of invitations I had, several of my books had sort of made some way an impact. So I found the number of invitations to speak I had increased. Although I don't accept all of them, I think there are some, where it's important and it's worth flying over. And also it's a great adventure. I sometimes feel rather like sort of, Bilbo, upon whom a kind of Gandalf is called, in that, I didn't start this international travel and speaking and all that stuff until or even for that matter, doing poetry readings anywhere or even my musical things until I was in my mid-50s, so or early 50s. So I'm now in my mid 60s. So it's been quite an interesting and comparatively recent adventure.
That's wonderful. And you talked about some of maybe the writing that really ignited your, not only your imagination, but your love for the written word. Where does that come from for you? That great love that you've developed that obviously would turn into as an author?
I think, well, in a sense, the love for the written word almost precedes my literacy. It's the experience of my mother, who was full of poetry, a wonderful Scotswoman, reciting poetry, and then my father reading stories to me when I was very little. The house was full of books, so I can hardly remember when it was that watching my father as he read, and sometimes he'd show me the books and move his finger on the page, and learning the letters. I did formally learn at school, I suppose, but I almost knew before then. But I suppose one of the first books I can remember reading, taking off on my own and just completely being absorbed in them were, interestingly, the C.S. Lewis Narnia books. And, here am I. That I would have been about 6 or 7 when I first essayed one of those, so I was quite young for it. But here am I, 66, and I'm still reading the same books and thoroughly enjoying them, and they still have more to give, So that was... I was exposed to really good literature from a very early age. My parents didn't believe in graded readers or anything like that, or limited vocabularies. And in fact, to get me to sleep or just to kind of comfort me with the sound of their voices, even when I was very young, when I was, an infant still, they read me poetry in my cradle. So even when I came later to read Tennyson or Milton, there was probably some deep, almost, natal echo of them somewhere deep in my soul. They came with a kind of glad familiarity.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
But of all the reading, in terms of prose, I would suppose Lewis and Tolkien are great favourites of mine, and I've written about them to some degree. But also in terms of poetry, the first poet I sort of fell in love with as a late teen, as somebody who could really get hold of it, was Keats. So I was very deeply into the Romantics, Keats and Shelley, Byron. Then I kind of went behind them to Wordsworth and Coleridge. I subsequently wrote quite a big book on Coleridge. But I also loved what are called the metaphysical poets, so particularly John Donne and George Herbert. But as you can imagine from all of that, these are all masters of the craft of making verse. They have beautiful meter and delicate rhyme schemes. I have to say that sort of 20th century verse that seemed to be without either rhyme or meter or reason for that matter didn't do anything for me. So insofar as I've established any kind of a reputation as a poet now, it's to do with recovering and reinventing or repurposing these older verse forms to speak with a contemporary voice, but still to have that beautiful music, the sound of the words, the rhythm and the rhyme of them. That's very important to me.
Is maybe part of your motivation behind that not just the restoration for itself, for its own sake, But maybe to help correct the ship in some fashion, do you think
Mm,
as a society we've gotten too casual, too informal, that we need some of that brought back into the pictures to restore the beauty of
yeah.
language? Is that part of your motivation as well?
Oh, absolutely. The beauty is really important to me. I think beauty is just an important thing that's been kind of gradually erased from our lives. And particularly when you're writing poetry at some depth, and poetry which, say, expresses grief or lament, people think to do that you have to write somehow broken or jagged verse. That's not true. I think the greater the weight of grief that a line of poetry or music is asked to bear, the more beautiful the line itself should be. I mean, it's the beauty that helps us bear with the grief, I think. I also agree with you about a general comment on society. I mean, if you look at the kind of phrases that are used to praise new art in sort of high-end circles, it's always about pushing the envelope or breaking the boundary or cutting the edge or something. It's kind of destructive. It's kind of impatient of form. Whereas, there are certain things that work very beautifully by form. And I think paradoxically, form gives freedom. You can sometimes say more with a sonnet than you can with a kind of long, splurgy thing. And I think that's to do with an even bigger problem in our society. I think it's as though we're stuck in a kind of permanent agonized adolescence where we don't want any rules. We always want to do exactly what we as individuals want to do without consideration for either what's possible or what's good for all of us together, taken as a society. Whereas I like the idea of, I'm a person of faith. I believe in God, and I believe that God has made me to be a particular individual with a certain kind of lifespan, and I'm a man, rather than a woman, all of that. And that's the given form that I have. Now, what I try to do is make the poem of my life within that form as excellently as I can. But I don't want to keep breaking that form. I think that's the particular form that I was given. I happen to be human and I'm not an eagle. It would have been interesting to be an eagle. I mean, in poetry, I can become an eagle. I can, as a certain songwriter said, fly like an eagle in my imagination. But I am still a flesh and blood human being. And I don't like the kind of technology that now seems to think we can transcend all that. So I believe that there is freedom to be found in form, which is at the present moment, a sort of hyper-postmodernism. That's quite a countercultural thing to think. But I actually think we all need to start thinking it soon, or we may end up breaking our own civilization. But because limit and freedom are intimately related. If you pursue freedom and freedom alone, and only personally for you, for its own sake, you end up with something so corrosive and destructive that it even destroys the freedom you're trying to exercise in the first place.
I agree. I think we do, as humans, we do better when we know where the lines are. As we color as young children.
Yeah. Well, it's like a football game. You couldn't enjoy a football game if there were no rules, It's the rules that make for the excellence of the play.
Yes. It's what actually forms the competitive element of it. It's just really interesting. I think that even developmentally, as children who have a strong sense of boundaries, know where the lines are, so to speak, those are the ones that thrive. But if you have no restrictions, no rules, so to speak, then those are the ones that struggle the most.
Yeah. And it feels a bit odd as a parent to say no, but actually you're enabling that child by learning their limitations. You're giving them a gift. Anyway, that's a kind of old wisdom that seems to have been lost. But I'll tell you an interesting thing, since your podcast is very much about music and people coming to the musical stage. When I was in my mid-teens and puzzled as to where all the good poetry had gone, why was nobody writing like Byron, beautiful rhymed stanzas? Why was there all this kind of post-Eliot? And then, of course, I bought a record by Bob Dylan and then another record by Leonard Cohen. And I got my answer. Curious enough, just at the point where the high-end literary poets were abandoning form and beauty, it was being rediscovered in the oral art form, the vocal art form of song. And I think we've been blessed to live in a generation of superb songwriters. And those songwriters have just got the same kind of skills and write in the same kinds of stanza forms often. I remember at one point an extraordinary thing, one of the late Leonard Cohen albums where it's kind of a bit of synthesizer music in the background and he's just almost speaking the song in a deep, gruff voice. He did, he started a song that says, "So we'll go no more a roving so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving and the moon be still as bright." For a minute, I thought it was like a new Leonard Cohen song. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's Byron. But the fact that I thought it was Leonard Cohen before I recognised that he was in fact reciting a famous Byron lyric showed me how good I think Leonard Cohen is, that I could have mistaken him for Byron for a moment.
You're right. I have always playfully thought I was born a decade too late. I was born in 1970, but I love the music from the 60s. For that reason, one, it's wonderfully melodic. But if you look at the writers, and one I would add to that brief list that you put is Paul Simon. I find him to be an incredible
completely.
lyricist, a bit of an Anglophile himself.
He, like Dylan, has carried on being brilliant right into his, current years. He's as good a songwriter now as ever he was.
Which is very rare. In fact, I have said this on multiple occasions that amongst those three, we're making great music well past beyond what most would. Writers are usually hot, quote unquote, for a period of time or for a sound of movement in music. But it's the rare composer that can stay relevant, so to speak, for decades. And I think we've touched on those that definitely have.
Yeah, I've been re-listening to some of that early Simon and Garfunkel stuff, Sounds of Silence and For Emily, wherever I may find her. And that is pure romantic. That is, that could easily have been written by Keats or Shelley, For Emily, wherever I may find her, easily.
Well, and it's interesting that, Paul Simon had such a great love for England. A lot of that was written while walking through the streets of small English towns. And so it's no wonder that it's wildly poetic, very beautifully written.
Funny enough, because I find myself on the road myself quite a bit, and I travel more often to the States than I should. I'm about to go off in December to New York, and I think that's going to be my 9th trip this year, which is about 7 too many.
Oh, wow.
But I often find myself having Paul Simon's song "Homeward Bound" going through my head.
Yes.
And for me, it is literally true, a poet and a one-man band, because sometimes I'm playing the guitar and singing at these gigs as well as poetry, although it's mainly poetry.
That's interesting you say that. I was just up to the wee hours of this morning editing my next episode with Carol Kay, and she in fact plays bass guitar on Homeward Bound. So I was just listening to that kind of...
What a thing. My goodness.
She plays bass guitar on Scarborough Fair, which is obviously there's a traditional element to that, but one of my favorite Simon and Garfunkel songs. So what the audience doesn't have the pleasure of seeing, because this is audio only, is that you're lighting up a pipe now. So I'm so curious. Let's say it's a stormy evening where you are. You've got a fire in the fireplace, and you want to sit down and do some reading. If you were going to pick a book, a pipe, and a tobacco, what would your choice be for such an evening?
Well, it depends on how long I felt I had to sit down.
Time was no issue. You had boundless time.
Well, for the book, if I wanted prose, I'd probably pick up The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings and just go to a favourite place, because I know the books so well. I've read them so often that I can say, oh, this is the time for Lothlorien, or this is the time for when the hobbits are in Beorn's house in The Hobbit. Or I like these distinct locations, I feel, and Rivendell, of course, the last homely house. So that I might just go to one of those places. If it's poetry, I'll often I love, if I'm reading it short, to read the poets who've got the ear for the sound of English. So I'll always go back to Keats. But I've been rereading a lot of Tennyson. At the moment, I'm in the course of writing some of my own ballad form Arthurian poems. That's my big project at the moment, is to try and retell the stories of the Holy Grail in poetic form. I think it's about time it was done again. Wow. So I often read other poets writing about the same thing, just to get a sense of the heritage that I have and the conversation into which I'm setting. I could endlessly read and reread, for example, the early Arthurian poem by Tennyson, The Lady of Shalott, which if you like rhyme, if you like the sheer pleasure of the sound of the as Dylan calls it, the vague traces of skipping reels of rhyme, then Tennyson's Lady of Shalott, doesn't get better. That on either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round an island there below, the island of Shalott. It's just wonderful. And he uses all these half rhymes as well. The willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver through the wave that runs forever round the island in the river, the island of Shalott. I could read that, all evening. So that would be the books. For the pipe, it would be one of my trusty Petersons. The one I'm smoking right now is a little Peterson silver spigot, which just the point where the mouthpiece and the bowl join, the stem and the bowl join, that's silver. It's a briar pipe, but it's very sweet. And tobacco in the evening, when I will probably also at some point be, needing not to sort of put my wife off by too heavy a tobacco thing. I smoke a lighter tobacco in the evening, so I might smoke a black cherry Cavendish or an aromatic. But I'll smoke the sort of stonkier English blends in the morning.
That's very considerate of you. Yes, they do have. They carry very differently within the room for the non-smokers. So that's a very considerate action on your part there. That sounds wonderful. And you talked about your love for Tolkien. What is it that you find about Tolkien that makes him such a unique author? I realize that's such a broad question, but I find myself immeasurably drawn to him as well. And for you, what is it that you find in his approach to writing, his word selection, the stories he tells, the way he tells them? What is it about him that you find yourself drawn to?
Well, I think what makes him such a good writer in the first place is that he loves language, and he knows language from the inside out. He was a historian of language. He deeply knows not only the English language, but all of the deeper roots of the English language. So he knows Icelandic and Anglo-Saxon and Old High German. He's got a very strong sense of the history of words. He was a contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is interested in the history of language and the etymology, and in how certain words have grown. And so he loves and cherishes words. I mean, in some respects, the language itself in which the books are written is as much the hero of the story as the books. So that's, the care he takes with place names. It's difficult to realize how good it is. I mean, there have been so many sort of imitations of Tolkien, which by people who don't know language and who just produce vaguely Tolkien-esque sounding names, but they haven't, But Rivendell, obviously, it's a beautiful word, but you can see that it means a dell or a valley which has been riven open, and that's exactly what it should be. But of course, the famous thing about Tolkien is that he loves language so much that he's invented a couple of extra languages, the two different forms of Elvish, which he kind of had going, we now know from his notebooks before. And he almost wanted to write a story in which he could imagine a world in which those languages would be spoken, as much as it was, that he just wanted to tell a story. So I think that's the first feature. I think the second is that he has a very deep understanding of enchantment in its best sense. That is to say, the power of language to create a world and to magically take you deep into it. And he serves that enchantment. I mean, his elves are the masters of that enchantment, really, very well, in that he, to use his own phrase, subcreation, he believed that we who are made in God's image have something like, obviously it's only a smaller and finite version of what God can create ex nihilo, out of nothing. But we can create out of the things which God has given us. And one of the things he's given us is language and imagination, and we can bring these two things together. But he regarded these acts, and he used the term subcreation, and to describe the worlds he created, he called them secondary worlds, which is very modest. Though I think he had a hope that God might even turn our secondary worlds into something more real at the end of things if he wanted to. That's the purpose of his story Leaf by Niggle. So he took an immense care over the creation of these sub-creations, the creation of these, to make them extraordinarily consistent. And one of the things that gives the consistency of reality, which he was looking for his books, is history. Part of the very substance of who we are and how we become ourselves is that we have a long backstory. Yours a particular one in America, but yours one eventually springs out from like a branch from our one in the British Isles.
Right.
And our one goes very, very deep past the Norman conquest, deep into roots of Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, and eventually Celtic things, all of which are languages that Tolkien has mastered. So when he comes to create Middle-earth, almost before he gives it any contemporary events that he's going to tell you in his story, he gives it a long history, and he knows that history. And even though most of it doesn't come into the foreground, and we've now got volumes and volumes of it, he had it all in his mind, so that his characters aren't thin. They've all got a rich hinterland, and they can, you're sitting by the fire, in the wilds on the still not yet in Rivendell, with the riders on your trail. You're sitting there with Strider, who's only, you don't really realize, and that Strider is in fact the king who will return. You don't know any of that yet. But Strider can sit and suddenly tell you the story of Beren and Luthien. And it's beautiful at that moment. Now, later, when you come to understand the entire legendarium, you realize how poignant and significant that is, because the story of Aragorn and Arwen is itself a descendant of and a reference to the story of Beren and Luthien. And their meaning of their love is partly informed by the meaning of the love of Beren and Luthien. But you don't know that when you're sitting on Weathertop and he starts singing this little song. But you, the reader, have this sense of a vast hinterland and past, which is giving substance and beauty and, if you like, depth and resonance to the story he's actually telling you now. And I don't think anybody else does that quite as well as he does.
I would agree. Do you think that comes from, people talk about character development, and it seems to me not so much to be the goal of Tolkien to develop the character, but to develop the history, to develop the land, to develop the language and the stories that helped form that character as opposed to forming a character. Do you think I have that right?
Yeah, well, I think he does that as opposed to describing a character. You learn more about Strider Aragorn's character by the way he reverently tells the story of Beren and Luthien than you would do if he'd written some crummy little sentence like Strider liked his heritage or something stupid like that. You see him doing it.
Yeah.
He's very much a show not tell kind of writer. Though I think he does develop the characters very deeply for you, and they develop through the action. You see, in a sense, Merry and Pippin, when they're at the beginning of the thing, are just kind of light relief, really, and kind of comedy, and that was rather played up in the films. But in the stories, they each have their own serious adventures, and they grow up and they mature through that. And of course, we see the astonishing development, really, of Sam Gamgee. I mean, Sam Gamgee, as the sort of faithful servant. I mean, a lot of people say that the relationship between Frodo and Sam is very similar. This comes out of Tolkien's experience in the Great War. It was the experience is the young officer and what was called his Batman, who is usually an agrarian or working class person, a private, but who's the kind of attendant and sidekick of the young officer. And there probably was something of that. There's probably also something of his reading of Dickens. The relationship between Pickwick and Sam Weller is also quite similar. But what you see, of course, over the course of the thing is the development of Sam and the strength and depth and courage and spirit of service in Sam. Almost for some people, Sam is the hero of the story. I mean, it's extraordinary. So that's remarkable. The other thing I think that he does splendidly is in the kind of larger architecture of the whole of the Lord of the Rings. And a lot of that understanding of character, and also in fact teaching of virtue and the difference between virtue and vice and the nature of evil, is that there are characters whom you can see in a sort of binary, and you can see one of them being, as it were, the good version of something, and the other, having been the good version, declining away from it. So it's obvious that Gandalf and Saruman are like that. And the confrontation between Gandalf and Saruman on the Tower of Orthanc, where, Gandalf Saruman wants to break the white, into many kinds, and Gandalf says, "He who breaks a thing to find out what it's made of is left the path of wisdom." They're different attitudes to their wizardly vocation and power. You learn what a whole deal about the nature of goodness just in that conversation. And of course, the same goes, there's a sense in which the two contenders for the actual king and ruler of Middle-earth are Sauron and Aragorn. And again, Aragorn, the one who walks alongside all the people that he will rule and comes to know them all individually, as opposed to this person who wants to rule, So you can see that. You can even see it in lesser roles. You can see the contrast between Boromir and Faramir is like that. Or the contrast between Theoden and Denethor. There's a series. And of course, most powerfully, in a sense, really going into the depth of psychology, in a curious way, you see Frodo and Gollum, who do have this deep kinship, and you see something going well and something going wrong.
Right.
It's that number of beautifully architecturally worked out pairings and symmetries. That can't be a mistake or an accident or a mere coincidence. That's deliberate artistry.
I don't know if you've read this as well, but I have heard that Tolkien did consider Samwise to be the hero of the story. In your analysis, would you agree with that? Do you see him as kind of the key hero to it all?
He's a very important figure. I don't think there is actually a single hero to the story. I also think Tolkien would be the first to say that the author's opinion is only one opinion among many. If it's a great mythopoeic story, as he would say, the story has more meanings than the author knows, as he himself discovered when, after the problem of atomic weapons and the danger of, using this destructive power, everybody, because it so happened that The Lord of the Rings was published after Hiroshima, people assumed that the ring was a symbol of atomic weaponry. And he had to point out that that bit of the plot had been constructed in his mind long before there was any talk of atomic weaponry. But it was such a true story, it was bound to pick up new things. Yes, I've seen that he said that, and I understand that. I think there's a perfectly good reading of it that way. But I think the real hero, if you like, is a kind of, to me, certainly in our age, I think the great lesson of the story, it's very easy to use and to abuse or even to sneer at that buzzword diversity. And sometimes people want to have diversity on a conference platform, not because they're really interested in diversity, but just because they want to tick the box, But if you think about real diversity, what it really is to love and look after one another in and with and through and acknowledging our differences, then the fellowship of the ring, with all these different, not just different races, but if you like, different kinds altogether, dwarves and men and elves, and hobbits, and a wizard, all working together. And the distinctive virtues of each of them complementing that of the other. I think that's the hero for me, is actually the fellowship, the whole fellowship, rather than a single individual.
If you consider the fact that there are enemies amongst the fellowship, so to speak, in terms of the broader people's discussion, you have elves and you have dwarves who there's a rich history of their lack of love for one another.
Oh, yes, exactly. And that's why Tolkien goes out, he zooms in and makes a particular thing out of the friendship of Legolas and Gimli. And he tells us, of course, not in the film, he tells us that because Legolas said that for the sake of his friendship, he would go through the mines of Moria with Gimli. Gimli promises, and he will go and see Gimli's kingdom. Gimli promises to go to Fanghorn Forest with Legolas. And of course, the really magnificent, it brings tears to your eyes, is when, Gimli, who carries all the traditional prejudices against elves, fully, when he sees Galadriel and, says that her beauty surpasses all the gold in all the mines of the world. And when he can have any gift, he asks for her hair, for a strand of her hair to set in imperishable crystal. That shows, he himself has been delivered from a besetting sin of the dwarves, which is greed for gold. But he has this courtesy. She compliments him for his courtesy, which is something that the elves were supposed to be better at. So, that's a wonderful moment of exchange.
That line reminds me a little bit of a poem, Summum Bonum, by Robert Browning.
Oh, yes.
And it's a very short verse. I'll read it for you. It's Summum Bonum. It says, all the breath in the bloom of the year in the bag of one bee, all the wonder and wealth of the mine in the heart of one gem, in the core of one pearl, all the shade and shine of the sea, breath and bloom, shade and shine, wonder, wealth, how far above them, truth, brighter than the gem, trust that's purer than pearl, brightest truth, purest trust in the universe, all were for me in the kiss of one girl.
Oh, it's
Isn't
brilliant.
that beautiful? It's a great
And of course,
verse.
lovely, that Latin title, Summum Bonum, the sum of all, sum of good, was one of the classical definitions of God. He was the summum bonum, the sum of all good. Yeah. Oh, Browning's. You can hear the feel he has for the sound of English just in the alliterations of breath and bloom and the lovely description of all the sheens of water in the world, sheen and shine. You know, that's very good.
When you think of the writing of Tolkien, obviously, and I've watched videos of you reading some verse from The Hobbit or from the Lord of the Rings books, is there a favorite spot that you would be interested in sharing with us that maybe is a favorite of yours?
Yeah, I could do that. I'm just going to step on the ladder of my library and get the book down. I think the arrival in Lorien is particularly well done, especially the way you kind of, the senses are so much enhanced because, of course, they're blindfolded. But there's a point where they cross over the stream, as it were, and they come into the place itself. And Frodo describes it as though they'd kind of gone over a bridge out of time. Yeah, it's just a couple of paragraphs, but I think it opens up something for the reader in the most extraordinary way. This is in the chapter Lothlorien. As they spoke thus, the company filed slowly along the paths in the wood, led by Haldir, while the other elf walked behind. They felt the ground beneath their feet smooth and soft, and after a while they walked more freely without fear of hurt or fall. Being deprived of sight, Frodo found his hearing and his other senses sharpened. He could smell the trees and the trodden grass. He could hear many different notes in the rustle of the leaves overhead, the river murmuring away on his right, and the thin, clear voices of birds in the sky. He felt the sun upon his face and hands as they passed through an open glade. As soon as he set foot upon the far bank of Silverlode, a strange feeling had come upon him, and it deepened as he walked on into the Nath. It seemed to him that he had stepped over a bridge of time into a corner of the elder days, and was now walking in a world that was no more. In Rivendell there was memory of ancient things. In Lorien, the ancient things still lived on in the waking world. Evil had been seen and heard there, sorrow had been known. The elves feared and distrusted the world outside. Wolves were howling on the wood's borders. But on the land of Lorien, no shadow lay. I think that's astonishing writing. And of course, that prepares the reader's mind for everything that comes. You read it with a heightened sense. And I go back to that passage and then read on quite often. If I'm, things are just dire, I can, as it were, mentally go to Lothlorien. Or spiritually, I might even say, go to Lothlorien and stay there for a while, and it restores me.
What a beautiful passage. And you realize how wonderfully poetic. What a brilliant author.
Yeah, you notice how he talks through all the senses. He has what it felt like under their feet, what they heard, the feeling of the sunlight on his face. It's wonderful.
What a gift. And it's so interesting that, the other author that you quoted as being so important to you was Lewis, and how interesting that they're both men of the same time, were friends
with one another.
Intimately so, and whose lives were very much, for a period of time, very intertwined with one another, not only from a literary and educational, their careers, but also their faith.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think Tolkien was instrumental in helping Lewis to come to faith, actually. I think conversations with him were highly significant. Yes, I've made a long study of them both, and it's always encouraging.
So I know you primarily as a poet, and as I mentioned, I've got a couple friends, Sam and Sean, that we've kind of gotten into your work collectively together. But there's so much more to you. Does it surprise you a bit that to so many people, you're primarily known as a poet, but there's so much more to your path, your own journey that, as to a lot of people like myself, has yet to be explored? Is it a note of interest to you that you are primarily known as a poet today?
Well, of all the things I could be known as, that's the one I'd most prefer to be known as. So I'm very glad that the poetry has kind of come to the fore. Obviously, just within my own ministry, I'm known as a priest, and that's, of course, equally, if not more, precious to me. Although I regard the twin vocations of priesthood and poet as mutually intertwined, I try to do my priesthood in a fairly poetic way, and I hope that there is a slightly priestly or sacramental element to my poetry. But yes, there are other things. I mean, I suppose I'm an academic in the sense that I've taught a lot in universities, and I have written academic books, and those things are important to me in this sense, in that I feel that just as I think poetry to some degree post-Eliot took a wrong turn, I think so has academia to some degree. I think it's been kind of browbeaten by the aggressive secularism of our age and stopped teaching some of the things you need to know in order to read literature well, including you obviously need to know the Bible in the King James Version and the Book of Common Prayer, and you need to know the basic outlines of Christian doctrine if you're going to understand anything written before the late 19th century, really. But students aren't taught that, and therefore they have difficulty with the poetry. So I've tried to make up for that gap. And I wrote a substantial book about Coleridge, because Coleridge is a great theologian. It kind of gave us a Christian theology of the imagination. But I found all the secular accounts of Coleridge had simply airbrushed his faith out of the picture, as though it's some kind of background 19th century religious noise or static that they could just, we're not interested in that now. But it's actually right at the core of his thinking and of his poetry. I mean, one of the great moments in one of his most famous poems, in which he's imagining how good it would be for his son to grow up amidst beautiful scenery and in nature, he says, it's in Frost at Midnight, he says, "Thou, my child, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountains, and the clouds which mirror in their bulk both mountains and lakes." And then he says, "So shalt thou see and hear." And he doesn't say, "So shalt thou see and hear some nice scenery," or "So shalt thou see and hear some geological formations," or, meteorological things. He says, "So shalt thou see and hear," referring to the whole landscape, "so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself, great universal teacher. He shall mould thy spirit, and by giving make it ask." Now that's a profound insight, but it's a spiritual insight into the fact that this stuff isn't just a bunch of phenomena. It's like a poem. It's like an utterance. It's telling us something. I mean, and essentially it's actually it's a biblical insight. It kind of echoes what goes on in Psalm 19, that the heavens declare the glory of the Lord and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork. Right. Night unto night uttereth speech. And I felt all this stuff is just being airbrushed out. People aren't even seeing it, So I've made a certain effort. And then, of course, in my discipline of literary criticism, but also to some degree in theology, I felt there was a loss of confidence in the transcendence and clarity of God's being, perhaps a loss of confidence in all that's revealed of God when he chooses to show us himself in the person and death and life of Jesus and resurrection of Jesus. So I've tried to write some theology which, if you like, returns to a deeper orthodoxy, but does so cognizant, of all the things we have to deal with in the modern world. And as far as literary criticism is concerned, I really felt that people weren't seeing the spiritual resonance of poetry. So I wrote an academic book called Faith, Hope and Poetry, subtitled Theology and the Poetic Imagination. in order to redress that balance. And I'm happy to say the book is still in print and is on various syllabuses and syllabi and curricula. So, I have tried to make a difference in the academic world. But if I were to be remembered for anything, I'd want it to be for the poetry.
You touch on something that is very important as we become more a secular society. I've heard that society referred to as a cut flower society, meaning it's a flower that has been removed from its roots and is slowly withering. And because of that detachment from the roots, there's a whole loss of subject matter understanding that cannot fully be expressed. And I think you've touched on that very, very well. There are things that are off limits or even out of reach to the secular society.
But I tell you who are the kind of Trojan horses who bring it all back in so that it's still there. The very people we've just been talking about, Tolkien and Lewis, because they're both people of faith. They're deeply versed in the strongest and longest and deepest traditions of Western civilization, and particularly, as it happens, of the Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic world. And they're channels through which that stuff is flowing to a much younger generation. But I really hope that the younger generation who know it all through the Jackson films do return to the books, because it's the language itself that teaches you something rather than just one director's take on it.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Malcolm Guite. My interview with Malcolm is one of the most wide-ranging and in-depth interviews that he's done to date. It was such a wonderful conversation, I decided to split it into 2 episodes. In part 2, we talk about Malcolm's thoughts about the Lord of the Rings movies, the character Tom Bombadil, and he reads one of his own sonnets, which is really, really cool. We discuss his own approach to writing and his love for the American blues. We'll be chatting about the poetry in scripture and the art of listening and much more. So if you love Malcolm's work, I think you're really going to love what lies ahead. Part 2 will be released on Monday, February 26, 2024. To make sure you get notified when it's released, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you have friends or family who you think would enjoy this conversation, then send them the link. We'll be back for part 2 in 2 weeks, and until then, keep your bags packed and join us on our next journey to the stage. And that is a wrap.